We will now present our paper, Liberating Labels, Decolonizing Language Use in Historical Collection Management and Data Contextualization. So a disclaimer before we start is that our presentation will discuss problematic language, in particular in relation to colonial context. So some words and images that we use may be problematic and offensive. Any shortcomings or misrepresentations are our own. The topic of our presentation focus on our responsibility when it comes to problematic language use, particularly in relation to the infrastructure and metadata that we build around colonial collections and archives. And we would like to focus on how we have been re-evaluating labels, titles, definitions, and descriptions that we added to our colonial sources. We will discuss some context in which this re-evaluation has taken place or is currently taking place. One is the consortium project Globalise. Second, the Combating Bias project at the Huygens Institute. And thirdly, the Words Matter initiative at the National Museum of World Cultures. We will illustrate both a number of challenges that we encounter during our work, as well as the steps that we have taken so far to address these problems. And we want to engage with the question, what is the role of the archives and other collecting institutions in providing a platform for different perspectives on the past, and how can changes in our language use in our practice will open up spaces for this. So our presentation will contain these parts. Firstly, I will talk really briefly about the motivation perhaps behind re-evaluating language use. Then Juliette will talk about the Words Matter initiative at the National Museum of World Cultures. I will then discuss some examples we encounter in the work of Globalise Project, and Manjusha will then discuss how Globalise is creating content warnings in our user interface, as well as introducing you to the Combating Bias project. And then we'll come to the conclusion with the discussion. Okay. So to begin, what is the reason behind this re-evaluation of language use, and why have historians and curators become increasingly aware of the role of language in conveying certain meanings about the legacies and the past? We believe that an important impetus for this was post-colonialism as a historical phenomenon and theory, because important theoretical insights by academics from the post-colonial school, such as Edward Said and his work Orientalism, pointed to the role of knowledge, of language and representation as vital instruments of colonialism. Because according to Said, knowledge produced by the colonizers about colonized groups often attributes a range of negative traits to the colonized peoples, and depicting them as antithetical to Western people and values. And these portrayals then served as a justification for colonial violence. And this way of thinking is still very much present in our today's society. Walter Mignolo, among other scholars, uses the term coloniality to refer to the knowledge systems that underpin colonialism, but still continue to exist in many ways, even after direct colonialism might have ended. And to pay attention to both colonialism and coloniality means that we need to really critically assess not only knowledge produced during the colonial era, but also knowledge and representations of peoples, objects, places, cultures, etc. in general. And we need to dismantle not only the language of colonial sources, but also any ongoing systems or language that base themselves upon or perpetuate inequalities, exclusions, and discrimination against other peoples, other groups. And this is a decolonial approach that we are taking with our work. I will now give the floor to Juliette.
So two of the contexts in which this critical assessment came to play were the GLAM sector, so galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, and the field of historiography, specifically on the colonial period as well. And historians and archivists have recognized the problematic content of colonial archives, which is often characterized by derogatory language with regard to formerly subjugated groups, and questioned the way stories were told and which individuals, groups, and objects were represented. They've attempted to highlight these problems, limit their impact, and reconceptualize the creation of knowledge. And there are many methods to do so, but this presentation in particular will focus on dealing with contextual information or metadata in archives and digital databases. So digitizing, metadata tagging, and describing sources are ways of democratizing these histories and their legacies and shifting them into a public domain. They should never be seen, however, as the end goal or the only form of attempted reparative work, because there are, of course, many different movements to, for example, restitute historical sources or objects. And this is not an idea of we tick this job off and we're done. Unfortunately, we'll never be done. It is about a convergence of many practices that together generate more just and inclusive futures. So through metadating, we want to enable these historical sources to tell their story in new places, share new and more diverse perspectives, and connect to similar information in other places. At the same time, we are keenly aware that archival and museological practices are linked to structures of power in government and are based on limited and predominantly Western knowledge systems rife with coloniality. No registration system is neutral, and it will always involve exclusions that must be challenged. And archiving and collecting in itself were also often the instruments of power used to maintain colonial relations, and that is precisely why current-day the custodians of these practices should feel responsible to do reparative work. The hope is that these projects will also create space for multiple voices, for different interpretations of the same sources. So practices such as persistent identifiers and linked open data can connect across boundaries between platforms and institutions, but also between languages and localities, thereby facilitating polyphony. And in doing so, we must move away from the Eurocentric canon and from the idea that knowledge is always linked to one single truth and hierarchical ideas of authority. We must make room for other forms of knowledge productions and other epistemic traditions. In 2018, the Research Center of Material Culture of the National Museum of World Cultures of the Netherlands published the guide Words Matter to contribute to the dialogue on word usage in the museum world and a broader cultural field. Built on previous projects, the guide discusses 56 Dutch and 55 English sensitive terms, describes why a term is sensitive, and provides alternative for more inclusive language use. So I've added a screenshot of one of the pages so you can see the term, then the explanation of why it is sensitive, and then suggestions for use or other uses. And many of these words relate to this description of groups of people and are often derogatory and discriminatory terms that originated from a perceived superiority of the white male colonizer. So with this guide, the museum also indicated, yes, thank you. It's open access, so you can just go through it. Paulina just shared it in a chat, I see. So the museum also indicated that the description of an object sometimes has as much meaning as the object itself, and that there is a major task ahead in addressing the language used in the museum's own archive and collection system. Please note that the guide was always intended as an unfinished project and part of a larger push to decolonize the museum. So we also kept a list of words to be added in an intended second iteration and worked on its implementation on different levels. And after that, a number of initiatives were launched to address this issue, including editing object titles and updating the thesaurus. I should say here, I no longer work at the Research Center for Material Culture and can therefore only speak about the work I was a part of and reflect on what I've seen as an outsider since. When I left, the focus for decolonizing the collection manually was deprioritized, and the focus shifted more to computational projects to add metadata semi-automatically, such as the Tagging the Picture project, of which I added an image in the screen. In that project, they use citizen science and machine learning to add metadata on images, and they also added some projects that focus on spotting contentiousness and detecting bias rather than mitigating that bias. As a disclaimer, I will say I personally strongly advocate for the manual labor of mitigating bias and believe museums should also prioritize these efforts. Because I believe that as custodians of the collections, we as white institutions have often built through exploitation and profiting on the backs of others. I think it's also our responsibility to sit with the discomfort, allocate the resources, and do the nitty-gritty work ourselves. And yes, that requires a lot of resources and labor, but I see those also as part of our accountability and a form of epistemic justice. Computational methods can definitely help in the process, but we shouldn't forget the invisibilized labor those methods often depend on and the shifting of complicity that can happen in using them. If we can do better by these collections and their histories, we do not deserve to be their custodians, a right that was already very arguable in the first place. So I will shift now to some examples. Because the latter part of my job at the Research Center was to adjust object titles in the collection, following up on colleagues that worked on that, Sonja Wijs and Robin Lelyveld. And a list was drawn up by colleagues at the collection department, such as Marijke Kunst, of objects whose titles contained one or more words from the Words Matter list, with priority given to certain words. And this originally evolved around 5,000 items. But it later became apparent that at least 20,000 additional item titles needed to be edited, and even then that will hardly be all. And that's also the case because these 56 words in Dutch are only a start, and more similar terms emerged during the work, and more language also continues to change, of course, and the work of decolonization never stops. Because, as Achille Mbembe says, it's like fighting against a complex mutating entity with concepts inherited from a completely different era. It's important to note that this is only a fraction of the work that ultimately may need to be done. And this project focused on the titles of the objects, but the far more extensive descriptions have not yet been systematically addressed. So a common comment in the public debate about changing colonial language is often that we are trying to rewrite history. The aim is never, however, to erase the colonial past, far from it, and to suggest that these collections and the institutions in which they are housed are not steeped in and built on imperialist thinking. Nor is it the aim to change the sources themselves. This work is about adding layers, using new metadata to show that the objects and sources have more to say than they have been given the opportunity to do until now, and to advocate for a more inclusive language. The old metadata, for example, was hidden in the more public-facing systems if it contained derogatory or undesirable labels, but it remained linked. So that way, if someone searches for such a term, they will receive results in the preferred terminology. And it would then also be desirable to add disclaimers to the collection so that there's transparency about these kinds of adjustments and systems, and to show that the sources and metadata inherently contain silences and always reflect the thinking of the creator, the registration system, and the collector and archivist. Within the museum, we have therefore chosen not to remove the old titles, but to add a new title in the system. And to have that in the language that we currently prefer. Unfortunately, the system doesn't yet provide space to uninvisibilize the curator or archivist deciding on these titles, which would actually help in being more upfront about possible shortcomings and bias due to human labor and positionalities. I don't know if many came here via the LinkedIn pop-up for this lecture, which mentioned archives don't lie. I would actually say archives do lie because people sometimes lie and people make mistakes. So using a glossary of specific terms could suggest that words can be replaced one-to-one and that the work is then done. Unfortunately, that is not quite the case because the crux of this type of work also lies in demonstrating that decolonizing metadata is not only about modifying existing descriptions, but also about supplementing and exposing biases and shortcomings. So the list of titles to be edited included many, many photographs. And while photographs are already never objective and always reflect the vision and often limited perspective of a photographer, it's immediately apparent that the additional layer of limitation was added by the titles. So very often only a very limited part of the photograph was described. For example, there are photo collections from expeditions in which vegetation was photographed with or in relation to people. And then only that vegetation and sometimes the white expedition members would be described, but the local population in the photograph, the knowledge holders who guided them, was not mentioned. So this resulted in a kind of symbolic annihilation that only contributed to their marginalization and othering. So I will show some examples of objects for which I edited the titles, and then you will always see the old title and the new title. And another example here. Yeah, so that's the close-up of the fern. And then I added, sorry, the titles are mostly in Dutch. I also translated them to English, but I think the Dutch was the core of my job, so I hope you understand some Dutch. A man holds up a finger plant, probably the Pleranda elegantissima, south of Palu, Sulawesi. So there's a lot of different layers on which I edited a title like this. Women are often not mentioned at all, let alone members of local population. So the other picture you saw, the caption of the photograph of 4 people from Flores and 2 priests on horseback. Only the white priests were mentioned. Group portraits were often described from a hierarchical perspective. So almost always the white men of status were mentioned first by name, followed by the other white people. If the people of color were mentioned at all, the description began with the men of status. And if their names were mentioned, they were often written in phonetic Dutch rather than according to their own spelling, or even they were misidentified, sorry. And the others were often reduced to a function, such as "and his servants." So one of the photographs from the list was this photograph that was titled Portrait of Antoinette Westerman and her babu. So Antoinette is the little girl. And thankfully, however, via information elsewhere in the album, the woman could actually be identified as Inem. The same was possible for the studio portrait of the babu with Jan and Agnes, the children of the Ninaber family, because this was in fact Mina, the woman who worked as a nanny for the Ninaber family. So by describing Mina and Inem as babus only, and via the possessive pronoun, they were reduced, as it were, to possessions of the children and stripped of their humanity. Their existence and importance was erased via the metadata, which also means that they could never be found via the search terms, even though they are present in the source. So the work then was not only to change the derogatory terms by which people were described, so in this case, they popped up because of the term babu, but changing the entire structure of describing. There are great examples of the difference also between digital systems and analog information frameworks. So the digital visitor will not have the contextual wrapper of the photo album and all the layers of information that are embedded that explicitly and implicitly. So that is why metadata is so much more important in these digital systems for users that are not able to come to the physical sources. So to do justice to these erased presences and use metadata to restore their humanness, you could even choose to completely reverse the hierarchy in the description. But perhaps a more neutral method would be to always describe the people and attributes in photographs from left to right, for example. Not super revolutionary, but still a way to keep checking yourself. Hey, who am I describing first? Or what am I describing first? The work is therefore also about describing what has been silenced and consciously thinking about this phrasing in hierarchical writing over and over. When considering the use of language and working towards broader and more inclusive access to these types of international historical sources, questions naturally also arise about language use in a broader sense. So, as Achille Mbembe says, colonialism rhymes with monolingualism. Although the photographs and objects come from all over the world, the metadata is almost always written in Dutch and often even phonetic Dutch. I mentioned earlier that people's names were often written phonetically and therefore incorrectly. And this was not only the case of lesser known people, but also for the very leaders of populations, such as Surinamese Kranman, sultanates, and Native American chiefs. Their names, but also their official titles, were written incorrectly, and they were sometimes mistaken for others, and some were only featured under nicknames given to them by the white opposing parties. And this obviously has major consequences for findability and inclusivity. This also relates to the use of autonyms. Which words matter? The starting point has always been to use autonyms first. So what are the local names for a place or object, and what do people call themselves? If someone is interested in the history of perahu boats in Indonesia, they might not come across prauen, as we have called them. Or worse, when it comes to objects of power, many of these objects proved both sources of fascination for colonizers and missionaries, and they were actively collected, but they were also ridiculed and belittled. So for source communities, some of these objects are literal ancestors, they are personhoods, while they have been reduced to fetishes and spijkerbeelden in the archives. That translates to nail statues. A more conservatively trained curator, though, would look for these descriptions. So work like this also involves attempting radical empathy and meeting different users where they are at and collecting and bridging different wishes. Another large chunk of the work revolved around toponyms and linking them to current locations and preferred place names. By claiming a place, colonial rulers often rewrote local place names and gave them a colonial toponym, according to their own significance. So Jayakarta, which is now Jakarta, was renamed Batavia by the Dutch. In Suriname, you will find Wageningen, Groningen, Lelystad. Mumbai was renamed Bombay by the British, and so on. So reversing these types of names also plays a really important role in the decolonization process. However, if you only use the current preferred name everywhere, you could also undermine transparency about the various forms of colonial violence of which this practice is a part. So to counteract this, you could use solutions such as Jakarta, and then in between brackets, Batavia in Dutch colonial times, or Bombay, colonial toponym for Mumbai, when it is relevant. So this way, the objects can be found using both search terms, and you immediately give visibility to this violence. So I've added 3 examples here. For the photo on the top left, it would make sense to keep the name Batavia in the title because it was taken during colonial rule and represents a part of the colonial occupation. The original title here was Een Coolie, or contract laborer at Batavia, Java. I then changed it to Portrait of a Contract Laborer in Batavia, the colonial toponym for Jakarta, but later it was changed again to be Portrait of a Contract Laborer in Jakarta. So this is also an example of how the guidelines can be interpreted in different ways, and how all of this work is dependent on those human interpretations. The other examples, however, show titles that have not been edited yet, but that could actually be seen as quite strong political statements, even if the location tag has changed. In the title, both of them still mention Batavia. So the picture top right was taken after the Indonesian Declaration of Independence on 17 August 1945, after which the city was actually known as Jakarta again. However, internationally, the new name was not recognized until Indonesia achieved full independence, at least according to the Dutch, in 1949. The photograph on the bottom, however, has absolutely no business, at least in my eyes, to have Batavia in the title. So mind you, by showing this, I'm not criticizing my, the colleagues working at my old workplace, but I'm just showing you that no archives is perfect, and titles and metadata can actually have a huge impact. And sometimes you're making political statements that you might not want to do just by not changing certain things. And place names in general are incredibly important to ensure that objects can also be found by source communities, by researchers and other interested parties. So a last example I will give is the use of the word binnenlanden, basically inlands, because coloniality and imperialism were generally very focused on port cities and ocean-facing localities. That's how they came there. But this strong dichotomy of the colonized center of power and the periphery is also still very present in the collections, or what they considered the periphery. Entire regions filled with people, culture, and nature were reduced to de binnenlanden van, the inlands of, inlands, which some will also say something about, or oerwoud, which basically means untouched primal forest. And they were deemed uninhabitable places. And so since both binnenlanden and oerwoud were on our contested list, these titles came up, and I found a whole album surrounding an expedition in the Surinamese rainforest as part of my work set. So by tracking this expedition, I was actually able to correct or even add some place names, or at least give like general locations to photographs, for example, along rivers, so that I could link them to current localities.
Yes. So I will now talk about some examples that I encounter in our work in Globalise. Alongside the heritage sector, there have also been many initiatives in the field of history that engages in this re-evaluation. And here the insights from the heritage sector has had vital impact and relevance for us. In the Globalise project, which Manjusha and I am a part of, is an example, and we have learned greatly from the Words Matter initiative, as well as expanding on their insights in how to deal with problematic language. So Globalise is an infrastructure project which makes the archives of the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, more accessible. The VOC was founded in 1602 and was a trading organization present in maritime Asia and the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa for 2 centuries. And it also established itself as a colonial power in many regions. During this period, it produced a huge archive of administrative correspondence, which forms a very valuable historical source. And to improve access to this archive, Globalise has converted nearly 5 million scans of handwritten documents into machine-readable text, which allows users to search through the contents of this giant corpus using keywords or word combinations. And Manjusha will speak more about this later in her section. But this conversion and transcription is only a first step. The VOC archive is at least 200 years old, so it contains many, many unfamiliar terms. To help with this, Globalise is building a thesaurus that defines terms featuring in the archive, such as commodities, terms for weights and measures, occupations, as well as ethnic and religious categories, among other concepts. The issue of problematic language, however, poses a great challenge to us because many terms and labels that the VOC use, especially to describe people, are controversial, offensive, or harmful. So in creating the thesaurus, we of course want to allow easy access to the archive, but we also want to acknowledge and alert users to this violence embodied in this kind of language. Erasing or censoring is definitely not a solution, as that would mean sanitizing this history and denying people of their right to bear witness to this violence. And also, these problematic terms are in many cases very important as keywords to search for certain groups in the archive. So if we omit them, we risk losing the chance of researching and finding more information about these already marginalized peoples. So we have decided to keep the problematic terms as part of our thesaurus, but at the same time, following the approach of Word Smarter, we also want to ensure that such terms are clearly flagged as problematic and provided them with clear explanations of why they are problematic. For instance, let's look at the term inlander, or which can arguably be translated as native in English, a problematic term in our thesaurus. And this is the definition that we give it in our thesaurus, which you can see is a very chunky definition that is divided into several parts. The first part, definition, is of course where we explain what the term means. And we also focus, in this case, on the meaning specific to the context related to the VOC. So in this case, Jakarta in the 17th and 18th century. The sensitivity section is where we explain why the term is problematic or offensive. Then the context section is where we include some information about how the term had been used by the VOC and how this use had, in one way or another, impacted the lives of the people whom the term was imposed upon. And by including this information, we want to go beyond merely identifying a term as problematic, and also to inform users of how the discrimination and violence were actually at play via such problematic labeling that the VOC practiced. One of the main challenges that we encounter is deciding which term is problematic in the first place. So for, an example is this term Javan in the VOC archive, which may be translated to English as Javanese. At first glance, this may seem to indicate the Jawa people or Javanese people in English, an ethnic group indigenous to parts of the Jawa island in Indonesia. The label does not really carry a negative connotation. So would it mean that if the VOC categorized someone as Javan, we can take it as an appropriate label to describe that person? However, the answer to this question for us at least is no, because when the VOC referred to someone as Javan, they did not necessarily mean the Jawa people. Most likely, they were merely identifying that person based on their presumed place of origin, in this case, the Jawa island. And the person might have maybe belonged to the ethnic group Javanese, but they might also have been Sundanese or Balinese or Majoris, ethnic communities who also inhabited the Jawa island at that time alongside the Javanese. So the VOC's category of Javan was more like a blanket label that ignores or disregards the ethnic diversities on the Jawa island. This is to show that labels featuring in the archive were most likely ascribed by the company to the local people, and in most cases will not correspond to the self-identification of the people in question. we also acknowledge our own limitations in deciding which terms are problematic and which terms are acceptable, because the archive covers a large geographical and chronological span containing information about numerous different communities and cultures, and it is very hard for us in order to be fully aware of all the sensitivities involved. And so deciding which terms to be used as preferred label for the thesaurus entries can therefore be very tricky, because language, as we all know, is constantly changing. What is considered appropriate today or here may be inappropriate in another place or time. Or even within the same place and time, there can still be disagreements over which label is the most acceptable. We can look at this example of the San people, an entry also in our thesaurus, who are indigenous hunter-gatherer communities of Southern Africa. So Dutch colonists refer to them as Bushmen, and this has historically been a highly derogatory term. Academics since the 1960s suggested replacing the term Bushman with the label San. However, San is also a pejorative term, being the Khoikhoi word for thief or vagabond that the pastoralist Khoikhoi people use for the hunter-gatherer people. So for this reason, some people have come to favor the label Bushman again over San, but still both remains highly sensitive labels. And our thesaurus chose San as the preferred label because it is used in more recent historiography, but we are aware that this decision is contested. And this is to show that, to quote the word of archivist Alicia Chilcott, it is perhaps impossible to find terms that will never be considered offensive. I will now give the floor to Manjusha.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sum. So Sum, in her section of the presentation, had introduced the Globalise project and how we deal with problematic language there. In my part of the presentation, I will introduce a different part of the project, which is the research portal that the project will make available at the end of this year. And what I really want to discuss with you in this context are content warnings that the project proposes to publish on the website, and this closely relates to the subject under discussion. So to make this discussion possible, I will once again, for the second time, remind you of what the project does. So the project essentially comprises of two parts. So the first, as Sum mentioned, is that we want to make the archives of the Dutch East India Company accessible. And these archives are available in the Dutch National Archives in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And as Sum mentioned, this is the administrative correspondence of the Dutch East India Company, which was a trading and colonial corporation that functioned over a very wide region in the Indian Ocean world for over 2 centuries. And this archive is incredibly valuable for rediscovering histories of a very large part of the Indian Ocean world, because it tells you so much about religion, culture, society, and political developments and economic and several other things that happened in this chronological time period in these parts of the world. So I'm a historian by training, and I trained in the use of the Dutch East India Company archive for my research. And I'm speaking about a time which was 10 years ago. So when I was researching the archive, I had to go to the National Archives in person. I had to request these inventories, which are these really fat ledgers that you see on the screen in front of you. And each ledger comprised of anywhere between 500 to 1,500 pages. And if I wanted to research anything in the archive, it meant that I had to go to the archive days on end and page through these fat ledgers in order to find what I wanted to. But now the Globalise project has done something very interesting, which is that, as Sum mentioned, they've converted 5 million pages of this archive from handwritten text into machine readable text. And what does this mean? It means that today you can put keywords in and you can find search results which mention the keywords that you were looking for. And secondly, as a historian, I had to be trained in paleography, which meant having to read the wriggly squiggly handwriting that featured on the pages of these ledgers because they were written in the 17th and 18th centuries. But now, because this text has been converted from handwritten to machine readable text, the necessity to know paleography, to be able to read these archives, will become less and less relevant. And to show you what the VOC archive is and what we will offer in the research portal that we will make available in December this year, let me use the example of the transcription viewer, which we have already put out online, and this is open access. But I must tell you that the transcription viewer is quite basic and doesn't capture everything that the project wants to do in the research portal that it will make available in December. But it does indicate the format in which the information will be presented. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. And if you can also play the thing. Yeah, thanks. So as you can see here, you enter a keyword. And then what happens is that the transcription viewer generates the list of inventories and page numbers that feature the keyword. And once you decide which page you want to read, it takes you to another page that features the scan of the page from the archive itself, alongside the transcription to the other side. So as you can see, the project wants to and hopefully removes all significant barriers to accessibility in such a way that people everywhere interested in these archives and the information that it contains can meaningfully research them in order to write diverse, new, and inclusive histories. And the project is also considering how it can either recommend or provide access to translations not created by us, but by third-party tools. So in this specific example, I have used the Anthropic AI's translation tool called Claude in order to generate a translation of the page. But it is not just the archive that we want to provide better access to, because we also provide information, as Sum mentioned, to the information that historians on the project are collecting about different kinds of entities that you find in the archive, like people, commodities, places, and people-related concepts. Next slide, please. So this was a slide that Sum showed earlier, and this shows you the historical contextualization layer that we historians make available to users that provides them with basic information that they will read about in the archive and will provide them the stepping stone for their future research. Now, this research portal will be available in December, as I mentioned, and I'm, of course, excited about it because it really puts together all the work that the project has been working on in the last 5 years. And I'm also excited about it personally because I am a historian, and it opens up the archive in ways that were previously inconceivable. But yet, providing unrestricted access to the archives is really a double-edged sword. The next slide, please. And this is because this archive is a colonial one and therefore problematic. It expresses the ambitions, the anxieties, the prejudices, and the interests of the colonizers. And the people, cultures, and societies that are written about in the archive are, of course, written about in a discriminatory, derogatory, and dehumanizing language. So when we as a project provide access to the archives, we cannot ignore the fact that we're also responsible for alerting users to the problems associated with it. So here, what I would like to do is to share our first plans about content warnings on the website. And I want to use this presentation essentially as a sounding board to hear your thoughts, your suggestions, and your advice on what information should feature and where. So, with regard to the question asked, what content on our website should we alert users about? Now, firstly, we want to alert users to the presence of distressing events and violent action in the archive, because this archive chronicles wars, conflict, enslavement, judicial punishments, which are also incredibly violent. And hence, the project will issue a general warning about this content in different parts of the research portal wherever relevant. Secondly, we will alert users to the presence of problematic and discriminatory language. Now, with problematic language, again, we will take different measures in different spaces in the research portal, and we will provide relevant guidance, content warnings, and descriptions where necessary. And here, we propose a two-tier approach when creating content warnings. Now, with regard to that space in the research portal where we will provide access to the archival data, so as I showed you, to the scans and the transcriptions of the archive, we will show content warnings, but we will not actively intervene to flag problematic language or offer alternatives. Now, the reason why we do not proactively address problematic concepts in the case of the archive is because we want to present the archive as it is. Because modifying the problematics of the archive, in a sense, constitutes erasure, and it interferes with the ability of the users to really critically engage to the fullest extent with descriptions of violence and harmful language that the archive bears. But with regard to historical contextualization, however, how, as Sum has shown, where we historians gather information and provide context about the archive itself, we will issue content warnings. We will actively intervene by flagging problematic content. We will provide information about the context of their usage, and we will also propose substitute terminology for harmful language where possible. So, what does this look like in practice? So in practice, the content warnings will feature in 3 different spaces in the user interface that we create. So first is a landing page. So as soon as you access the website, this is the first page that you will see. And second is the page on the archival scans and transcriptions. And thirdly, in the context of the historical contextualization data. And in each of these spaces, the content warning will be indicated in such a manner that the user cannot overlook or bypass it, but at the same time does not impede the functionality of the user interface, so to speak. I have also written out the content warnings that will be displayed in each of these separate spaces. I will only read out one for the sake of also just keeping to time. But to give you, and I will do so to give you a sense of what it is that we alert users to. So with regard to the landing page, we will say that we intend to make the VOC archives more accessible, and that these archives are records of the past as mostly encountered, interpreted, written about, or translated by the company as an organization and company personnel as individuals. They bear political, religious, racial, cultural, gender, and other prejudices and agendas. The archive carries records of a wide range of distressing events, including enslavement, conflict, judicial punishment, exploitation, marginalization, problematic characterizations, and language, which can be painful and discomforting to read and engage with. And furthermore, with each of the content warnings that we provide, we will also give a link to what is regarded as a more detailed summary of what the project does and its standpoint on the issue of violent action as well as problematic language in the archive. And this will be a long read that will be presented elsewhere that users can choose to access if they so prefer. I look forward to hearing your thoughts about the content warnings in the Q&A, and I hope that with the feedback we receive, we can ensure that we responsibly engage with the content of the archives when we finally unveil the research portal in December. Next slide, please. So to move on to the next part of the presentation, I would like to introduce you to a project that was created for the purpose of addressing biases. And this is the Combating Bias project, and it ran from September 2024 to 25, and it was based at the Huygens Institute in Amsterdam. And this project was funded by the Dutch Research Council and was facilitated by the thematic digital competence centers in the Netherlands. And it had 4 members, which was myself and which included myself. And most of the project was undertaken by our very driven and motivated data stewards, Amber Zalma and Mrinalini Luthra. And the principal question that the Combating Bias project asked was, how can we reform data creation practices in the social sciences and the humanities such that they are technically sound and ethically informed? And I will focus on the ethical aspects of the project. And in this context, the Combating Bias project created guidelines and practical tools to help researchers identify, describe, and reduce biases in their data. And the data that we initially wanted to address when the project commenced were historical data sets or structured information extracted by researchers from historical sources like archival collections. But the guidelines that were developed were intentionally created to be applied to all kinds of data that researchers create and curate. So in order to do this, the project asked 3 principal questions. What exactly do we mean by bias? Where does bias occur in data creation? How does it compound? And how do we identify, understand, and reduce bias in our data sets? And in order to answer these questions, the project teamed up with 4 partner projects and 9 advisors, all of whom either actively worked with colonial archives or similar corpora of data and created data sets, or they were scholars who addressed the themes of bias in their roles as educators and archivists. And based on a series of interviews that our data stewards Amber and Mrinalini conducted with partner projects and advisors, and also by presenting their work at different venues, they created a series of tools that are now available on the Combating Bias website. And each of the tools addressed each of the questions asked. So what was created? There was a bias vocabulary that was developed, and there was also a detailed bias-aware data lifecycle that was sketched out. And there were guidelines and a toolkit that were also created in order to address biases in this bias-aware data lifecycle. Next slide, please. So what was the bias vocabulary? So what was bias? And the project very early on realized that we wanted to depart from a very militant kind of conceptualization of bias that the title of the project had, Combating Bias, and instead adopt a more tolerant view of bias, recognizing that it is not something that can be really eradicated, but it had to be understood, documented, and made more transparent. And secondly, Mrinalini and Amber worked on identifying concepts associated with the theme of bias and defining them. And this allowed us to really pin these concepts down and to offer a modicum of standardization so that people speaking about and engaging with these concepts were able to use a common vocabulary. The next was that the project identified 5 stages of data creation: setup, collection, process, analyze, and preserve and share. And for each stage, advice was offered to data creators on what steps they could take to ensure that their work was as bias aware as possible. And this advice was given in terms of good, better, and best practices, what questions data creators had to ask themselves to ensure that they worked responsibly with the data, and what resources they could use to learn more about bias and how to tackle it. And all of these outputs were interconnected in that users were informed about which concepts were associated with bias, how they were defined, which stages of the data lifecycle they manifested in or needed to be taken in consideration in, and which guidelines and resources users could use to address these issues at every stage. Next slide, please. To give you an example of the outputs of the project and how they interacted and informed each other, let's look at the example of the guidance on harmful language that the project created. So the guidance, as you can see here, it features a definition. It indicates where in the life cycle the bias is likely to manifest, which is at the process stage, and what the good, better, and best practices are for dealing with harmful language in data creation. Now, the reason for indicating good, better, and best practices is taking into account the fact that different projects run on different timelines, deal with different methods of funding and recruitment, which means that the amount of effort and attention that different projects can give to attending to biases in data creation can be very different. And hence, it is always essential to provide guidelines that takes into account different needs of different projects and different data creators. Now, this template of good, better, and best is not our own. It was adopted from a seminal article written by Juliette Huygen on precisely this theme that I have presented in the slide, which is harmful language. And we have adopted this framework for all the suggestions that we offer across addressing all varieties of bias that we engage with. Now, in addition to providing guidance on what data creators can do to tackle problematic language, we also indicate which resources are available for them to delve further into and to educate themselves on each of these themes. So in this instance, Juliette Huygen's work is offered as a resource. There are, of course, many other resources that we have collected that can be accessed using the link given on the slide, but I was unable to put everything into this one single slide here. So please feel free to look up our website and the tools and resources that we signpost. Over to you, Juliette.
So even if we have talked for about an hour, this is actually still just an introduction to the subject of problematic language use in historical text and collections and the infrastructure surrounding them. It also we pointed to the challenges faced by historians, collection workers, and archivists in decolonizing language and reflect on some of the initial solutions to address the problems. We've attempted to consider the possibilities that digital enhancements and metadata infrastructures can give historical sources more nuance. And despite the sincere intention of all of these projects to address this issue, the fact remains that the archives and collections we work with are enormous and full of terms that need to be addressed. And this presentation is therefore also a plea for more projects that critically engage with inherited knowledge. Galleries, museums, and archives are now resolutely pursuing this agenda of decolonizing language, but there is still a lot more work to be done. Studies that historicize and contextualize labels and definitions of different social groups and ethnicities can be invaluable in decolonizing language in general. So with the extreme advances in digitization techniques and in particular the use of artificial intelligence, we must also ensure that historical labels and characterizations are contextualized and used responsibly and try to prevent misuse. The urgency for such initiatives is therefore all the greater. In our view, it's undoubtedly a positive development that this revision and reevaluation of historical records and descriptions of artifacts is so much more prevalent. A particularly promising feature of these initiatives that was also integral to Words Matter, Globalise, and Combating Bias is the active involvement of these institutions with the groups and communities for whom the stories, meanings, and relevance of these archives and artifacts are important. Their insights often differ significantly from the meanings that these archives and artifacts have been given within the spaces of Western archives and museums. It would be particularly valuable if more projects and infrastructures were to be developed that facilitate this polyphony and multilingualism. So to paraphrase Boaventura de Sousa, knowledge can only be seen as universal if it is, by definition, pluriversal. Only through such initiatives can these objects be assigned lost labels and meanings, thereby ensuring well-rounded descriptions. The decolonization project is far from over. We academics are only just beginning to grasp the true extent of the problem, and it will take years before we are able to rightly restore it and correct the injustices it carries and draws upon. And moreover, language is always in flux. it is a beast that must be constantly tamed. So we can agree that the decolonization project will always be a work in progress and will always have room for change. Thank you so much for having us, for listening to us. We've added biography and list of images so you can check them later if you want to. And then we open the floor to you for any questions you may have. We've also thought about some points that we would be interested to discuss, but first to you.